When and how did the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints codify and formalize its anti-Black racial restriction policy, a policy that would persist until 1978? My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religion and have written a few books on Mormon history. This is the third video I have done in a weekly series on the origins of Mormonism's racial restriction. I did a previous video on Joseph Smith's views on race and slavery, then a video on Brigham Young and the inauguration of a racial policy in 1852. And today I want to bring that story all the way up to the early 1900s, because it was not until 1908 that the racial policy was formalized and made systematic. It is one thing, in other words, for Brigham Young to declare that those with African ancestry were cursed, and it's another to institute a policy in which they hold second-class status within the faith. That's what I want to talk about today. I'm also going to highlight and emphasize the lives of Black Latter-day Saints during these years, because they often get forgotten in our institutional histories that focus on the LDS Church and its elite white leaders. But it was the actions and activities of Black Latter-day Saints that often prompted changes, and they were also the primary recipients of the harm that was done, and so we need to keep their lives in focus. So let's dig into the history. But first, a couple of pitches. First, I want to recommend one of the best digital resources available in the Mormon studies community, and that's at the University of Utah, directed by the wonderful Paul Reeve, the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies in the University of Utah's History Department, on the Century of Black Mormons. This project that has a digital component led by Paul Reeve, but including dozens of excellent researchers have been able to capture and detail the lives of hundreds of Black Latter-day Saints between 1830 and 1930, hence the Century of Black Mormons. These individuals that often get forgotten in the white-centered narratives and histories of Mormonism. So I strongly recommend going to check out their website. Again, Century of Black Mormons. And second, if you enjoy this type of content, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel and like and share this video if you find it interesting. All right, now let's get into the history. I want to frame this history, the long 5-decade road to an official anti-Black racial restriction in the Latter-day Saint tradition, through the lives of 3 Black saints. 2 of them are quite famous. You've probably heard them before, Elijah Abel and Jane Manning James. But I also want to talk about Elijah Banks, a lesser-known Latter-day Saint, one of these lives who have been captured in the Century of Black Mormons story. I want to emphasize their lives because it shows that the anti-Black racial policy was never predetermined to happen, but it came as a result of particular personalities and events that came before 1908. So let's start with Elijah Abel, perhaps the most famous Black Mormon in the 19th century, in part because he was the first Black convert ordained to the priesthood. And not just ordained to the priesthood, but ordained as 70, with Joseph Smith's explicit blessing. At a time when people were raising questions about his racial status, it was made clear that it was not an obstacle, that it was okay for him to be ordained. Those were questions asked back in the 1830s and 1840s. And Elijah Abel therefore served several missions for the LDS Church, including frequently to Canada and Cincinnati. He was often assigned to preach to Black communities, in part due to the discomfort expressed by white Mormons due to the racism that was already in place within the community. Once the Saints move out to Utah, Elijah Abel eventually migrates out there as well, initially settling in the Mill Creek region, which would soon become a hub for the small but vibrant Black community of Latter-day Saints, though Abel would move around the Salt Lake region at various moments. By the late 1870s, however, questions started rising about his status as a Black priesthood holder. He was denied access to temple rituals, which was a change from before. He was allowed to participate in the Kirtland temple rituals, and though he was gone during the Nauvoo temple, there didn't seem to be any evidence he would have been restricted with those either. But by 1879, there were a series of discussions specifically about Elijah Abel. One of the people involved, Zebedee Coltrane, someone who went all the way back to the earliest years of the faith, started telling revisionist, fictitious stories about Elijah Abel, questioning the validity of his priesthood ordination, claiming that Joseph Smith later changed his mind and that Elijah Abel's priesthood was stripped. That is a falsehood. That never happened. However, this caused Elijah Abel to go in front of church authorities and present his case. And guess what? It appears that he won, at least in 1879, and they recognized the validity of not only his priesthood, but his son's priesthood. And then in 1883, at the age of 75, Elijah Abel was sent on yet another mission. Think about that. At the age of 75, this Black Latter-day Saint, whose entire experience negated this idea of a systematic racial restriction, was sent again on a priesthood mission. He was set apart for his mission by Joseph F. Smith. Remember that point because it's going to become relevant later on. And then he died shortly after this mission. In fact, he had to come home from his mission due to health concerns, and he died in late 1884. But his life seemed to signify the much more racially universalistic origins of Mormonism, even though racism was always there, but the constricting confines were definitely present in his later life. Perhaps the second most famous Black Mormon during the 19th century was Jane Manning James, a Black woman who converted to Mormonism, walked all the way from her New England home to the saints in Nauvoo, was denied passage on the steamship that many of the white Mormon converts were allowed to take down through the Great Lakes region due to the racial restriction policies, and then once in Nauvoo told her faithful narrative and even lived in Joseph Smith's home. She would later tell the story about how Joseph Smith offered some type of temple sealing ritual to her. The nature of that, and perhaps the validity of that, is up to scholarly debate. Maybe I'll do a video on that in the future. But put simply, Jane Manning James felt like she belonged within that faith, that it offered a racial universalistic package that matched her vision of a racially universal sense of salvation. Now, she moved out to Utah, like many other converts, and lived within the LDS community. She was active in her ward, active in the Relief Society. But like with Elijah Abel, starting the 1870s and 1880s, as the temple rituals became much more widespread with the completion of several pioneer temples, there was a question of whether she could participate, despite the fact that she was offered some type of temple ritual decades earlier in Nauvoo. She petitioned nearly every church president, starting with John Taylor, also Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, Joseph F. Smith. Every time they became there was a new prophet, she would send them a petition saying, "I am due my right as a Latter-day Saint to be blessed in the temple." Her famous quote in these letters was, "Is there no blessing for me?" Eventually, she was allowed to do baptisms for the dead in the Salt Lake Temple, but that was it. In fact, it was in response to her petitions that one of the most difficult to decipher and troubling temple rituals ever took place. Because while she stood outside the temple, a ritual that was seen as a sort of compromise between Jane Manning James' petitions and the church's now vision of racial exclusion, this compromise ritual took place. Again, Jane Manning James had to wait outside the temple, and inside the temple, Joseph F. Smith stood in for Joseph Smith, and Zina D. Young, who was the General Relief Society president at the time, stood in for Jane Manning James, who again was alive. She was just not allowed inside the temple. Those two stood across the altar, and Zina D. Young, on behalf of Jane Manning James, was sealed to Joseph Smith, who Joseph F. Smith was standing in for, as a servant for the eternities. A servitor was the word explicitly used. This is especially troubling to us today, and there's no way to sugarcoat it. But this was the compromise they came to reach. However, as the wonderful scholar Quincy Newell has argued in her scholarship on Jane Manning James, it appeared this ritual satisfied neither Jane Manning James, who continued to petition church leaders for actual blessings, not being sealed as a servant, which definitely has some enslaved undertones, nor was it satisfying to church leaders because they never replicated that ritual for anyone else. Now, Jane Manning James continued to live faithfully in the LDS Church despite the increasingly confined status for African Americans, and she died a fully fledged member of the gospel. Joseph F. Smith, the president at the time, spoke at her funeral and gave some really troubling remarks when he said that Jane Manning James will now be free of the racial curse and be white again, showing that Jane Manning James could never truly transcend her racial status. Actually, I'm not done with Jane Manning James because I want to add one more story that kind of emphasizes how uncomfortable Joseph F. Smith's remarks were, or just how the church handled her in general. In her last petition to the first presidency, after Joseph F. Smith became prophet, years after the servitor sealing, Jane Manning James wrote a letter to Joseph F. Smith, not only asking for a temple sealing, but demanding a reason why she hasn't been granted it. And she included in her letter a marked envelope for Joseph F. Smith to respond. He never did. How could he? If you've heard of Elijah Abel and Jane Manning James, I now want to introduce you to Elijah Banks, because I believe these stories are important so we understand the stakes when the anti-Black racial policy is introduced around 1908. Elijah Banks was born enslaved in Tennessee, moved to Minnesota for new opportunities late in the 1800s, and eventually converted to the Latter-day Saint tradition. He also married a white woman as his wife. Her name was Carolyn. They were active members of the Mormon branch in the Minneapolis region. In fact, here is a grainy photograph from the Sunday school of that congregation that features Elijah Banks well-dressed, looking confident, feeling like he belonged within that community. However, that photograph, which was taken around 1902, was kind of a shifting point, because as the racial confines within the Latter-day Saint movement restrict, people like Elijah Banks don't fully understand their place. Elijah Banks and his wife Caroline were part of this new wave of converts to the Mormon tradition who weren't migrating to Utah, who were scattered across America, especially in urban communities like Minneapolis. And this forced the church to have to better define what their racial boundaries are. And so Elijah and Caroline wrote a letter to church authorities asking, what is our place within the church? And sadly, things are going to change before they get an answer. Because the Latter-day Saint community, just like the broader America, it is faced with the question of racial restriction in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. One of the greatest scholars from the era, W.E.B. Du Bois, a Black Harvard-educated scholar, argued that the problem of the 20th century was going to be the problem of the color line, because in the wake of the Jim Crow Supreme Court decision, the collapse of Reconstruction, and the rise of racial segregation, these racial boundaries placed within American society are going to define all aspects of social life for the following few decades. And nowhere was that segregation more palpable than within the churches that dotted America's landscape. So nearly every congregation, including the LDS Church, was now having to face the idea of what do we do with racial inclusion and exclusion. When Jane Manning James died in April 1908, she was the last living memory of a much more racially inclusive Mormon tradition. Though again, I want to emphasize, there was always some level of racism. They could never really escape that. But with her gone and Elijah Abel, who died a couple decades earlier, this allowed church leaders to now rewrite their history. Within a few months, Joseph F. Smith, who was the president of the church at the time, gathers with other church leaders, and they conclude that they are going to institute a formalized racial policy. Part of this came as a result of petitions that came from missionaries and mission leaders across the nation, like the letter concerning Elijah and Caroline Banks in Minnesota. These questions that decide, how do we determine someone's racial status? What percentage of their ancestry is necessary to determine whether they are African or American? If a white man marries a black woman, what do we do with their children, or vice versa? And it is in response to those questions. And by the way, the fact that those questions continue to come in, and there were dozens upon dozens of these questions arriving in Salt Lake City without a very formalized response, it demonstrates that there was not a consistent, coherent, cogent racial policy at the time. Otherwise, there wouldn't be these questions. But in response to these questions, in a First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 meeting in late 1908, Joseph F. Smith and the other leaders of the faith both rewrite their history and institute a new policy. Joseph F. Smith reverses his previous argument that Elijah Abel's priesthood ordination was valid by saying that it was a mistake by Joseph Smith that he later said, that he later came to regret. Joseph Fielding Smith, Joseph F. Smith's son, who is an apostle and would later become president of the church, even concocted this ridiculous theory that there were two Elijah Abels, one the black who wasn't ordained to the priesthood and one white who was ordained. It was nonsense, but those are the lengths through which they were going to rewrite their past to justify a racial exclusion policy that they believe had been present since the beginning. And then they instituted this new policy based on the same racist grounds, the anti-black white supremacist grounds that was dominant across America, which was the one-drop rule. If you had any African ancestry, you were, if a man, barred from priesthood ordination, and then if you're a man or woman, you were barred from temple rituals. So when the First Presidency Secretary sent their letter in response to Elijah and Caroline Banks, it specifically told them that you could remain members of the faith, but you could never be sealed to each other. Elijah could never be ordained to the priesthood, and they would never be, in other words, first-class saints. The letter said that at some point in the future, you may know why, but that is up to revelation. It's a very hard ask. However, the Banks, I should note, remained faithful within the LDS Church for another 2 decades until their death in the 1930s, frequently attending church, paying their tithing, and probably hoping that this racial restriction that could not be fully explained would come to an end. So it may come as a surprise that over 5 decades transpired from Brigham Young's declaration in early 1852 that there was a curse placed on those with African ancestry, all the way until 1908, when Joseph F. Smith and the church presidency formalized that theology, that anti-black theology, into a racial restriction. But that's how history works. And I hope this story, this overview, can emphasize that none of this was predetermined. None of this was set to be from the beginning. Instead, it is a product of culture, of personalities, and of actions. And then in telling this story, we need to foreground the lives of the Black Latter-day Saints who are both prompting these actions, as well as suffering the consequences. That we need to not just understand the institutional history, but the lived reality of these anti-Black racist policies. I want to highlight a few really, really good books on this topic if you are interested in learning more. Paul Reeves' Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, published by Oxford University Press. In fact, all these books are published by Oxford University Press, is a phenomenal magisterial overview of Mormons' relationship to race, which not only has an institutional history of these policies, but captures the lives of these Black Latter-day Saints and places it within the broader American context. I also strongly recommend Joanna Brooks' Mormonism and White Supremacy, American Religion and the Problem of Racial Innocence, which really digs into this anti-Black racial ideology behind the policy and how it relates to broader cultural currents in America. And finally, if you want a good biography that foregrounds the lives of those affected, Quincy Newell's biography, Your Sister in the Gospel, The Life of Jane Manning James, a 19th century Black Mormon, is a phenomenal biography of Jane Manning James that both captures the details of her life, but also meditates on its meaning. It's a masterclass of historical work. I hope this video made sense. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and share it with others so that we can get these stories out. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so. History has never been more relevant than it is now, even while it is uncomfortable. History is supposed to make us wrestle with these difficult issues. And that's what I hope videos like this one may accomplish in doing.